As you know, around about 2010, the Americans decided that they were going to reorientate particularly their military and diplomatic resources to Asia, particularly East Asia, away from Europe and to some degree other continents. Why? Because the Americans lost so much ground in the first 10 years of this century, especially to the Chinese, partly as a result of their involvement in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but also because of the economic rise of China. Now, it's going to fail. It's going to fail. They're not going to be able to do it. And the reason they're not going to be able to do it is because, essentially, the pivot relies fundamentally on hard power. It's a military realignment. It's an attempt at consolidating the existing alliances in the region, especially the ones with Japan and South Korea, to some extent with the Philippines and so on. That is not the reason for the decline of the United States. It's not a military neglect that is the reason for the decline of the United States in this region. The reason for the decline of the United States in this region is the declining economic strength and presence of the United States in this region. Do you know that in 2002, the United States accounted for 23% of trade in East Asia? Today, 10 years later, it is 10%. Over the same period, you have exactly the reverse in China, exactly, literally, to the nearest digit. China in 2002 accounted for 10% of trade in this region, and now it accounts for 23%. That is the reason for the decline of the United States in this region. And I'll tell you something, it is inconceivable that that process will be reversed. Inconceivable. This is one of the great secular historic shifts that take place. There is nothing in that sense that the Americans can do about it. So the great question facing, as I say, the countries in this region is, you are moving into a new world, which is a world in which China is very much more important in your region. How are you going to relate to it? How are you going to engage with it? And so on. And here I want to be a bit critical, I think, of the Philippine government in the recent period of relationship. I mean, you have a problem. The first problem that the Philippines has is that relative to the other countries in the region, apart from Indonesia, which is still behind Indonesia, is that your proportion of trade and economic involvement with China is relatively low in contrast to the rest of the region. And yet China is clearly the biggest growth pusher for all the economies in this region. I mean, China's rise is the opportunity. It's the opportunity for other countries in the region. And if you looked at the figures earlier on for the proportion of trade, Filipino trade with China, it's been rising rapidly, but it's still only third behind the United States and Japan. It will overtake it within the next, probably the next 2 or 3 years, but it's still been relatively low. The other problem, I think, is how to handle the question of the islands. Now, I don't personally have a view about, I'm an agnostic, about the China's claims on the various islands in the South China Sea with whoever, whether it's Malaysia or Vietnam or whatever, or the Philippines. I'm not an expert on it, and I don't have a view. But I do think that it's very important that somehow or other this question is handled in a way which recognises that the strategic question facing every government in this region, first and foremost, is how to develop a good strategic relationship with China. And some countries have done it well. Malaysia is a classic example. Malaysia's got bigger arguments, at least as bigger arguments with China as the Philippines, but it's not resulted in a serious deterioration in their relationship. On the contrary, the relationship between China and Malaysia throughout this period has remained a warm relationship. And I don't think that it serves the Philippines well in this period to think, well, maybe the Americans will give us some support. We know America's pivot means that they want to try and retrieve some of their situation in this period. So that will also help, will be helping the Americans, and the Americans will be helping us. I think this is a short-sighted game. I really do. Because the wind is not blowing in this direction. The wind is blowing somewhere else. Now that doesn't mean I'm arguing that the Philippines should give up its claims. I'm not arguing that at all. What I'm arguing is a way has to be found to deal with these questions, and a solution has to be found which doesn't involve derailing the relationship or poisoning the relationship, or seriously worsening the relationship with China. Because that ain't going to get you anywhere. It's just going to put you in a very sticky position. And the other ASEAN countries, by the way, largely recognise that, because that's why they've been saying, several have been saying to the Philippines, look, steady on here, this is probably not the way to go. And I don't think the Chinese, I'm not arguing the Chinese have handled themselves well over the last 2 years. I don't think the Chinese have handled themselves well over the last 2 years. Not for some of the lurid arguments that are used, but simply because I don't think the Chinese know what they want. The Chinese are operating with two positions. They're operating with the 9-dash line position, which is a claim over the whole of the South China Sea, and they're operating at the same time with a much more limited claim, which has some legitimacy, in relationship to the Paracel and the battles. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, argues for the second position, but others argue for the other position. And you know, the Chinese do not act with one voice, not only with one voice, but with one body in the region. The Chinese have at least 5 or 6 players in the region, all in the regard to the South China Sea. They've got the fisheries protection, the coastal guard, local government, state-owned companies, and so on. Actually, the PLAN, the Navy, has been a very minor player in this. So the Chinese have not got their act together in relationship to this. But I'll tell you one thing, and that is the Chinese will not go to war over these islands. They will not go to war on these islands. Where there might be a war is in relationship to the East China Sea and the claim over the IU or Senkaku Islands. Why? Because that's about something completely different, isn't it? That's about history. That's about the failure of Japan to apologize. Now, on this question, my sympathies are absolutely with the Chinese. But I think this is different from the question of the South China Sea. Now, I wanted to make that detour because I know you're all talking about it. And it's very important to and I just think, don't lose the sense of perspective. Don't fail to see the big picture. Don't fail to see which way history is moving. You know, smart governments think strategically. They have a sense of the future. They have a map. Therefore, they can recognize in the present what to do and what not to do, what the priorities are and what the priorities